Get Patricia.
We had Patricia Stokey introduce herself.
Okay, great. Well, I guess, Jeff, you want me to take it away?
Yes, go ahead and take it
Okay.
away. Please.
Yes, and I'm Nancy Buchan. I'm a professor at University of South Carolina. I say the roots of my interest in cross-cultural communication negotiation began as I watched my parents, my mother's Japanese and my dad is from the Midwest, and basically watched them communicate and miscommunicate my whole life. But they've been married close to 60, almost 70 years now, so they're getting by. So anyway, welcome, and it's great to have all of you here. So this actually is chapter 9 from our book. It's a chapter on virtual communication and what isn't being said when communications are virtual. Here's a couple of interesting quotes by Paul Extel. In-person meetings provide a sense of intimacy, connection, and empathy that is difficult to replicate via video. Okay, I think many of us could agree with that. And then La Ka-shing said, information and communication technology unlocks the value of time, allowing and enabling multitasking, multi-channels, multi-this and multi-that. I thought that was kind of a fun one. And I think we can all empathize with that too. Okay, so virtual interactions are defined by the use of information technologies to facilitate cross-boundary communication to accomplish critical tasks, right? And it's said to have these various elements: geographic dispersion, electronic dependence, dynamic structural arrangements, and national diversity. The problem is that what's being said is even more difficult to decipher. Because in those environments, the ability to decode and read implicit communications between the spoken or written line, right? And whether communicators are higher and lower in contextualization will influence the understanding and effectiveness of the interaction. So again, going to kind of how this idea of virtuality is conceptualized, it says, do the information technologies employed allowed for co-presence, visibility, audibility, contemporality, simultaneity, and sequentiality? So you can think in, virtual interactions comprise everything from a phone call, an email, a WeChat, all the way up to a Zoom meeting, a simultaneous Zoom meeting. So just to understand that that's kind of the whole spectrum of virtual interactions that we are talking about. But as we know, there always are some technological glitches and possible things that hamper what we're doing. And so obviously this leads to the potential for diminished understanding of the verbal exchange or the communicated exchange, and the impeded encoding and decoding of whatever may be nonverbal. And I should say, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to, maybe Jeff, if you can look for hands up and just let me know, just signal, or if you just want, just shout out and please let me know if you have any questions.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so when you're studying virtuality, there are two theories that are of critical importance. One is communication bandwidth theory. And this is actually taken from engineering, a theory that was borrowed from engineering. So it's how many channels of communication are used by a given medium at once, and how much information can be effectively transmitted and understood at a given point in time. So, it seems quite logical or quite sensical. Face-to-face communication is superior to all other media, including computer-mediated communication, because it possesses the most communication channels and allows for the transmission of multiple information bits. So it's how much information can be transmitted simultaneously at a given point in time. The other theory is media richness theory, which says that communication media vary in the amount of information they're able to transmit, and importantly, the depth of detail articulated, and even more importantly, the richness of the messages conveyed. So when we talk about what is rich communication or information rich communication, so you can think of the various nonverbal cues as to what's really being said, right? Tone of voice, inflection, silence, volume, facial expression, timing, gestures. So all of that adds to the richness of communication, but all of that has the potential to be lacking or somewhat limited in virtual communication. Furthermore, in virtual communication, you can see that there might be status or language-based communication barriers. Actually, that also exist in face-to-face communication. So there actually exist situations when the effectiveness of communication via virtual means may equal or exceed the effectiveness of face-to-face communication because of these status and language-based communication barriers. So, for example, email is a very lean communication medium where the message is encoded in words that lack nonverbal cues, right? It's your email. So if you think of tone of voice, right, may carry with it an authoritative, norm or an authoritative position, or might signal someone who is timid. But because tone of voice is not a cue that is available in email, things are equalized, right? The words are equalized, the status of the words. Furthermore, you can have an imposing or a very humble posture, right? When someone is communicating face to face. Again, that's not contained in the words of an email. Furthermore, lean communication channels, such as email and can reduce culture and language-based cues. So, for example, there are no accents, and depending on whatever stereotypes one may have in their minds when they first, hear that accent, it may cue various positive or less positive reactions, right? But there are no accents in email. And this is actually something that we were talking about in my class yesterday, because I was teaching a class on virtual negotiations. And a number of the speakers who are non-native said that they felt much better doing an email negotiation than face-to-face because they felt like they had time to respond. They had felt like they had time to carefully read through the email and understand, each of the things that was concessions or whatever issues that were being proposed, and then they had time to respond. So in these ways, standardized computer-mediated communication, email, has the potential to equalize language-based power in multicultural teams, but still at the risk of losing richness of meaning and expression, right, that we find in face-to-face encounters. So that's a good thing. Oh, Jeff?
I just had a question of extending it beyond emails as a base case of non-person interaction.
Yes.
Being the age that my hair represents, I do have interactions across generations by age as well as nationalities, and we have text messaging, but now we've gone even beyond that.
Yeah.
In the form of things like WhatsApp.
Absolutely.
And that creates kind of a couple of elements there that's not present in emails.
Okay.
And I found having conversations with people literally around the world through the text messaging aspect of WhatsApp, but WhatsApp also has a live communication capability.
Yes, it does. A video. Yep. Mhm.
And I was like, why are we not talking about this instead of we're just living in textual basis? And so we,
Exactly.
like, go,
Yeah.
oh, kind of thing. So anyway, I would offer up that's a bit of a nuance, and
No, you're quite right. Anything like, all I meant is anything that is not, where there's not a visual communication channel as well. So, WhatsApp, you're using just the kind of texting medium instead of the, the
yes,
WhatsApp
yeah.
call. Yeah.
The other little piece I had is that how in the person setting you have an incredibly rich bandwidth being communicated,
Absolutely.
but on the receiving end, you may not have quite the same capacity to absorb,
Yes.
process the whole gamut of that's being available across the five senses, and now the nonverbal side that we're talking about today. So it's in some respects, it's how much the receiver can actually process of all the data that's being communicated in live. Anyway, so
You're quite right. You're quite right. Yep. Great points. Anyone else? Okay. So, let's just a review of what is context-dependent communication. It's the unspoken, unformulated, and explicit rules governing how information is handled and how people interact and relate. And that's from Edward Hall. So the more information rich is a communication medium, the more easily will contextual cues be recognized and understood. But again, as Jeff was saying, that's not always a given, right? Depending on who the interactants are. And I would say if you saw one of our first talks talking about the fields of experience and how the extent to which those fields of experience and the cultural backgrounds of the interactants overlap, there's more of a likelihood of all those cues in that very information-rich medium being understood. The further away they are in terms of their fields of experience, the less likely they are to be able to understand and pick up on those cues. So again, the more information rich is the medium, the more fluently will nonverbal messages be encoded and decoded, with the important caveat that it really depends on the field, the fields of perspective, right? The cultural backgrounds of the interactants. But here was a Brazilian manager on the exclusive use of virtual communication during the pandemic, instead of being able to use face-to-face interactions. Nonverbal communication gave context, and with remote work, it felt like we were getting one piece of the puzzle at a time from each interaction. So he was not a big fan of virtual interaction, and you'll see another quote by him later on. So let's talk about the message context. Researchers say there's likely no more complex situation to encode and decode nonverbal communication than when interacting cross-culturally by virtual means. And here, I mean any kind of virtual means, not just emails, but WeChat, WhatsApp, Zoom, Teams, whatever. And why is this? Well, it's because there's uncertainty regarding communication and social norms. Members may have access to different information. And language barriers create fault lines and status differences that are often different than the distinctions in the culture themselves. And we're going to get into this a little bit more deeply. But what we're talking about here is, imagine a lot of my experiences in Japan, and I know some of you will be able to relate to this, but imagine you have someone who's very, very high in your office, the Sacho or the Bucho or somebody like that, who's very high in the office, and in personal interactions, it's clear who the boss, who's the boss. But if the Sacho or the Bucho do not know English, for example, and that's the language that this now global team is going to use in a Zoom meeting, that person now somewhat has to take a little bit more of a subordinate position to perhaps a younger team member who speaks English fluently, right? So the status differences can sometimes be turned upside down, or at least a little bit more in flux when you're using virtual communication. And all of these various things may lead to conflict. And then to add on to that, though, with virtual actions, display and understanding of nonverbal cues is inhibited and nuance is lost. So the resolution of that conflict that is likely becomes more difficult. So we're getting to a rather bleak situation. Let's talk a little bit about more deeply into why that conflict occurs. So face-to-face encounters provide for deeper information exchange, right? To replace our initial social categorization. So you are having a meeting and you meet people for the first time face-to-face. You might have an icebreaker. You start talking to one another, and maybe you thought, oh, that woman who has her hair so tightly pulled back, and she must be really rigid, right? Well, as you're talking with one another, maybe that breaks down. It's like, oh, she doesn't seem so rigid. She's pretty cool. She's sharing with us, right? So your initial social categorizations can break down in face-to-face interactions. But in virtual communication, those in-group, out-group distinctions, right, or those categorizations may be based solely on easily accessible social categories, such as ethnicity or nationality. And they don't tend to get updated because you aren't getting that relational information. And then those distinctions often lead to stereotyping and distrust of the counterpart, exacerbating the difficulty of clear information exchange, right? Whether it's verbal or nonverbal. So cultural diversity, something that we celebrate of team members, and the in-group out-group identifications that may unfortunately result are likely to cause communication breakdowns, making it difficult to aggregate and process information, particularly for knowledge that is uncodified, right? Nonverbal, the nuances, the cues. So alas, all is not lost. There are some ways to overcome some of these challenges in in virtual communication. First of all is, we know that emotional intelligence, which is a person's ability to detect, understand, and manage the emotions of others, that people who have high emotional intelligence are effective at detecting and managing the emotions in information lean, or we suspect that they will be more effective than others in detecting and managing emotions in an information lean virtual environment. We know in an information rich environment, they're very good, and they're people who have high emotional intelligence are superior to others at detecting, understanding, and imagining the emotions of others. There's a potential that they could be the same in an information lean environment. Cultural intelligence, or the capabilities that enable someone to function effectively in culturally diverse environments. Research has shown that an increase in a team's average motivational cultural intelligence increases cohesiveness, trust and morale, and satisfaction with the team and performance. And the motivational cultural intelligence of the team leader also is a necessary condition here. And finally, you can have cross-cultural training. So Early and Peterson say, an important first step for leaders is to obtain information regarding members' cultural backgrounds, time constraints, terminology, including slang, colloquialisms, jargon, and communication preferences, and develop a training program that educates both the leader and follower about their respective cultures prior even to people engaging in the virtual communication. Are there any questions about the communication domain? I mean, the message domain, forgive me. Okay, well, let's move on to the relationship domain. So compared to face-to-face interaction, virtual teams tend to communicate less information. They develop relationships at a slower rate, and trust development is more challenging. And let's go back to media richness theory here. Remember, there were those two theories that I said were kind of going to be the foundations of this chapter. Media richness theory would say that in relatively information-lean virtual communication environments, there's a lack of the capacity to convey verbal information such as warmth, and thus relationship development is inhibited. But studies indicate that it is possible to strengthen these affective states, that warmth, right? That relational feeling, and that virtual teams are able to share relationship supportive information via virtual tools. So all is not lost, again, in the relationship domain. The question is which tools and what information? So for example, if you use direct emails, instant messaging, phone calls, conversation which is less inhibited by social norms and group pressures, research has shown, tends to reduce the potential for production blocking, right, or communication and evaluation apprehension, and provide more convenient or direct access to team members who have problem-relevant information. So communication via direct email tends to be, for example, tends to be less inhibited by social norms. And again, let me go back to my class that I taught yesterday on virtual negotiations. So one very important finding in that we see in virtual negotiations versus face-to-face communications is that, interestingly, women are more hostile. And let me say how it's defined by those researchers. It's the use of threats or coercion, that sort of thing. And women become more hostile, use more threats or coercion in virtual negotiations than in face-to-face. And why is that? And I won't go through all the theory, but a lot of it is that in virtual communications, they feel more anonymous, and the social norms which may constrain their being more aggressive or assertive in negotiation aren't at play, or at least they don't feel the constraints of those norms as much in the virtual communication, right? So that's just an example of how people feel or experience social norms less in virtual communication. So furthermore, direct emails, instant messaging, phone calls, anything that's, or WeChat, that sort of thing, you have a record of communications and decisions. And as we said before, in the message domain, people have more time to digest and consider information shared by team members. Junior members may feel less encumbered by social norms. Again, think of that junior Japanese sarariman who's doing the negotiation because he's fluent in English compared to his sacho, who is not, right? And also, non-native speakers have a better chance of fully understanding the communications. So there are two different forms of information sharing in the relationship with respect to the relationship domain, with differing influences on outcomes. Unique information sharing entails instrumental information specific to the task at hand. So it's linked to problem solving and task performance. Okay. Open information sharing refers to information that promotes relationship development among team members. So it relates to team satisfaction and cohesion. An example of this was seen and illustrated by Chinese managers during COVID. So these managers were able to increase the leader team member psychological closeness. They were able to curb anxiety and nurture social bonds with employees by using an information-rich virtual medium. So they used WeChat video conferencing. By using this virtual medium, leaders were able to convey personal feelings, so that open information sharing, not just the unique task relevant information, but that open relational information sharing via nonverbal cues. Any questions about or comments about the relationship domain? And we can certainly talk at the end, but I just want to see if there are any questions. Okay, moving right along. The time domain. For groups residing in different time zones, trust development is likely to be inhibited if a colleague does not receive a teammate's reply, for example, to a message in a timely manner, right? Whatever they perceive to be timely, right? Why aren't they answering me? What's wrong with them? Why can't they, hold up their end of the game, right? When there is little temporal overlap, interactions might include multi-hour or multi-day delays that result in individual team members being excluded from the decision process and the group's work becoming out of sync. And I'm sure many of us have experienced that. So because of this, research demonstrates that the team members tend to reduce the overall amount of information conveyed, limiting their messages to problem-relevant, unique information, that task-relevant information, and curbing the amount of open, relationship-building information. And this is particularly acute in newly formed global virtual teams, where uncertainty is high because there's a lack of familiarity, trust among members, that feeling of psychological safety among group members. Furthermore, even in the same time zone, virtual work can impede that open information exchange in conversations, sometimes forcing interactions onto a more formal schedule rather than allowing things to happen casually and organically. So we're going back to Brazil, and another manager was talking about the situation imposed when everything had to be fully virtual interactions during the pandemic. And he says, first, employees lost the informality of work life. Instead of informal, fluid communication, collaboration, participants had to book appointments and schedule time to discuss simple issues. Second, good humor behaviors diminished, implicating connectedness. Third, nonverbal communication ceased, and employees lost facial expressions, eye contact, and other prevalent signs necessary for context. Fourth, the loss of unstructured exchange of experiences and ideas lessened tacit knowledge sharing. And I'm wondering if any of us have had that kind of experience, especially during the pandemic, maybe when, certainly when teaching. I know that I found it very difficult to form relationships with my students the way that I do like to in the classroom, face-to-face, when things had to be just online.
So Nancy, I have a quick
Yeah,
question.
please.
So shortly after the pandemic, we released a survey and did some research on virtual communication. And I found really interesting that the attitude for the Chinese respondents was more positive, and that they seemed to be able to get more out of virtual communication, which kind of spoke to the earlier slide.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's been a while since we've done that study. I'm just wondering if there's any additional thoughts you've had on that.
Oh, that's a good one, Jeff. Thanks for putting me on the spot here.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
And Wendy, feel free to chime in.
I mean, the my initial sort of thought
yeah,
is that a lot of there's a lot of negativity around virtual communication in the US, for example. Many people were turning off their cameras, or the kids in the classroom, their cameras were like pointing up to the ceiling, and
yeah.
there just didn't seem to be that kind of embracing of what you might be able to get out of this.
Yeah. I'm also wondering if there was a greater understanding among the Chinese that there was more tacit knowledge. And so, because there was more tacit knowledge, the communication flow was more productive. That even if even there was the most nuanced cue, they might have understood it. Whereas in maybe in the US, students didn't. I don't know.
Yeah.
Anybody have any thoughts? Okay. We'll have to think about that one. You're the Chinese expert, Jeff. Yeah, no, we'll definitely have to dig more deeply into that. But there is a good question of why are some cultures more adept at using virtual communication than others?
Yeah.
And I do think it has to do with social norms and tacit knowledge.
I don't know if you can hear me, but I have an idea that why that might be,
Oh,
especially
thanks, Sean. Okay.
some of my Chinese students. I think that they come from a more disciplined educational system.
Mhm.
And if you bring them together, as I had to teach through virtually, during the pandemic. But I think that if you as a teacher have them and say, look, we really need you to pay attention here. We need the cameras turned on, et cetera. They seem to be much more in compliance than students who are not used to that. I mean, students who are not in this rigid background, not rigid, but
Sure.
not in his disciplined background.
Absolutely.
That might have something to do with it as well. And also, I'm a big believer in using Zoom calls and things like that. So I think that's important as well. But that's a whole other issue of how do you stay in touch and become more human and so to speak.
Exactly. How do you provide for that better flow of open communication?
Yeah.
As opposed to unique communication. And yeah, so I think your first point really gets to that social norms. What are the social norms of education? In between the Chinese professor and the Chinese students versus the American professor and the American students, for example. Our different environments. Yeah. Okay, so in the time domain, we're back in the time domain. So when is the best time and what is the best timing for virtual communications? Research says that it has to be the first message. In the first message, you have to, as much as possible, develop a relationship-oriented, open communication so that you're signaling to the group the importance and the appropriateness of such messages and the regular dynamics of team communication, right? It's okay to sometimes discuss not specifically task-oriented issues or information. It's okay because that's it's appropriate because that's what we're trying to do in terms of team building. So what that does, that first message, then, if you are able to use that relationship-oriented communication effectively, it establishes a psychologically safe communication climate. It reduces that stereotypical thinking that we talked about before, those in-group, out-group categorizations among culturally diverse team members, fosters familiarity, and promotes a sense of inclusion and common understanding. And then how do you follow up then? How do you foster informal relationship building? And there's this idea of a conversational firm that promotes open access to information that anyone can obtain regardless of time zone, or I would say status in the company. And so what that does, it eliminates any kind of hierarchy and employee voice, right? Anybody can have access to this information. Anybody can see it. Anybody can react. Also, set aside a time during the day for synchronous virtual meetings. And I think that's what you're talking about, Sean, where everyone's camera is on so that team members can meet and talk and share ideas. You know, I just let me just say an aside here. I had a friend who traveled to I think it was Finland, Sweden and Finland, I think. And she was talking about how every day they have a time during the day when everybody takes a coffee break and no one talks about work. Everybody is kind of, everybody takes this break and no one talks about work. It's like, wow, that is amazing. I actually mentioned that to my students and some of them hated the idea. You know, that's enforced, you know, familiarity. That's enforced, you know, but I mean, I personally, I think it's a great idea because you're building those relationship bonds, right? You're promoting more open communication. And then with that, ad hoc conversations can then happen more organically on email or group chat as per various team member schedules or inclinations. Okay, the space domain. Greater spatial distance between team members hampers verbal and nonverbal communication among the team, as you would expect, both open or unique and relationally oriented information. It hinders the sharing and coordination of knowledge, and it impedes outcomes such as innovation. Why is this? Because it's something called we call situated knowledge, because these team members who are, you know, communicating from their various places around the globe are embedded in different external contexts and thus have less shared contextual knowledge, right, relevant to the team, with far greater understanding of their own geographical context than of someone else's on the team, right? I might understand much more about my context here in South Carolina than I do about, you know, y'all's context out in BC or Portland, right? And then members may take for granted their tacit common knowledge of the local context and how it influences their communication, and find it difficult to articulate how and why such context is relevant to the team, right? So if I'm on a team and it's just natural, having now been in the South for a while, although this would be probably relate more to my children than myself, and they would say, "Sir and ma'am, yes, sir, thank you, you know, yes, ma'am," right? Other team members, some actually, I know some people actually get a little offended when you say sir and ma'am, right? And perhaps I don't understand, you know, why it's so natural for me to do that. And it's a natural sign of respect that I just don't understand why anyone would find that maybe somewhat objectionable. And then is physical, and then so because we're kind of stuck in our we take for granted our tacit and common knowledge, right? And we're kind of stuck in that situated knowledge. As the physical, social, or temporal distance from one another increases, in this case, members tend to rely on higher level construals about another person. So psychologically, you're more likely to construe or represent that person in terms of just a few generalized abstract features or traits, right? Japanese, Korean, black, white, female, male, et cetera, right? The closer an individual is to their interlocutor, the more likely they are to represent the person with more contextualized or concrete traits, right? Oh, a female professional Japanese woman, right? Who is of higher status, etc. So you start adding those contextualizing concrete traits. And for those of you who understand what it means to be a professional Japanese woman, you know that that has a lot of meaning, right? Thus, the more distant virtual communicators feel to one another, the more likely they are to default to stereotyped cognitions of them. Furthermore, higher level construals from a further distance lead to inferences about behavior that are dispositional rather than situational. They did that because they are so, they are so and so, right? Rather than situational. They didn't answer my email because they're, or don't care, rather than possibly something that's situational. So what can you do? You need to find ways to reduce that psychological distance. And, this became a very popular recommendation during the pandemic, but to provide in-person retreats. But the reason they're so critical is that they provide face-to-face interaction time with team members, allowing for more interactions among them and allowing for more exchange then of that open relational information. And actually, research has shown that for teams that have a hybrid strategy using both virtual tools and in-person meetings, the relationship between overall information sharing and team performance is stronger than for teams that met only in person or only virtually, which I think is interesting as well. Communicators have the chance to interact in person and gain from that interaction, information-rich information in terms of the ability to recognize and understand nonverbal cues. So, when I'm meeting you face to face, you all of a sudden say, oh, you match the face to the name, right? And you start understanding some of their nonverbal cues, how they use their hands, right? Where they look in an interaction, where they face, their tone of voice, all those kind of things. You're able, it's because of the more communication rich medium or information rich medium, you're able to recognize and understand those nonverbal cues. Well, hopefully, depending on the person, obviously. Such information understanding then can be carried over to less rich virtual environments, fostering greater overall understanding. So you meet them, you start to get a beat on how they interact, what are the various cues that they may send or understand, and then you can use that information in the virtual meetings. Okay. So in each of these chapters, we end with a number of propositions. So here are the ones from chapter 9 on virtual communication. Relative to communicators low in emotional intelligence, communicators high in emotional intelligence have a greater ability to detect, understand, and manage cues that are being sent them or the cues they send in information lean communication environments, such as those that occur with virtual communication. So if you go back to, remember, we were talking about this with respect to the message domain, and we know that in information-rich communication environments, communicators high in emotional intelligence have greater ability to detect, understand, and manage cues. We suggest, well, hopefully that will be, you will find the same relationship in information lean communication environments. And these also are the propositions, but they're kind of ideas for future research. By promoting the development of emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence, cross-cultural training that helps communicators understand their own and others' visible behaviors, as well as the underlying norms and values, that is both verbal and nonverbal communication, will promote the development of greater ability to detect, understand, and manage cues being sent them, or the cues they send in virtual communication. So basically we're saying, we we would propose that cross-cultural training would enhance the development of emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence. And actually, we have shown that already. We have shown the positive relationship between the cross-cultural training that we provide through IC Edge and cultural intelligence in our Academy of Management Discovers paper. Communicators higher in context dependence and hence higher in cultural intelligence will display greater synergy, direction, and social integration in virtual interaction settings than communicators lower in context dependence. Okay. So I think, you know, when I teach IC Edge and context dependence, you know, the idea is not that we want to change people, but we want to make them aware, right? That the world is full of contextual cues, right? So we're not saying you always need to be a higher context communicator, but just be aware of that, right? So the hope is that as we train people, they become more aware of context dependence and can recognize these cues when they're being sent. Then to provide for optimal understanding and engagement by both higher and lower context communicators in virtual communication interactions, there needs to be a balance in the frequency or timing of virtual messages between too much relationship-oriented communication for the lower context communicator and too little for the high context communicator, right? Because the high context communicator is going to want that information, you know, that relationship-oriented communication. And the lower context communicators, you know, they just want the facts, ma'am. You know, they want that unique information. So there needs to be some kind of balance between the two. A hybrid communication strategy combining virtual and in-person interactions with current technology will yield a stronger performance between information shared and team performance than will either virtual or in-person interactions alone. And this is kind of a replication and a slight extension of the finding that we talked about earlier with hybrid. And then finally, a hybrid communication strategy combining virtual and in-person interactions with current technology will yield a stronger positive relationship between information shared and team performance for communicators higher in context dependence than communicators lower in context dependence. So basically we're saying, you know, there's a premium that's to be had for communicators who are higher in context dependence, and that they will understand the cues more effectively, more easily, more efficiently, and be able to act upon them. And okay, so just we've got 3 minutes left, but just to let you know, here is the outline or the table of contents of all of the chapters of the book and all of the things that we are going to be speaking on in these lunch and learns. So now, are there any questions at all? Any comments?
I have a quick comment,
Yes, please.
I really like the last chart that you explained, where it's a combination of things and so forth. But I think it comes down to one of the key things here is, if I could quote Red Auerbach, who's a famous football coach, a basketball coach. Sorry about that. Anyway, he says it's not what they hear. It's not what I say. It's what they hear.
Absolutely.
And so I think a combination of group meetings, et cetera, and then really doing a fine job virtually. I think it's a great combination, and there's so many ways to do that, with bringing groups together, et cetera, and synchronous meetings and things like that. But anyway, but I like the last part that you said. That really makes a lot of sense.
And I think you're exactly right, Sean. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, that's okay. I wanted to thank you. And I should say that I taught at the University of South Carolina in Aiken.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Long time ago. But anyway.
Go Gamecocks.
Yeah.
So I will say, you know, it's interesting, and just Wendy's gone here, I think, but so much research is on the transmission of the cues, right? But I like how you are really emphasizing the receiver, right? And we really need to continually think about both sides both sides. And I think a lot of this team research did try to capture both sides, but you're right to emphasize it.
Thank you.
I would add that understanding the context of what this virtual group is about. Is it an ongoing, and so I'm looking outside the educational setting, but I do have applications education side. Is it an ongoing team?
Mhm.
And so there versus something that is a task specific. It could be a project, a negotiation, or it could even be a classroom that has a defined period of time in which a group of individuals that may be known or unknown to each other beforehand meet together for a very time specific period of time.
Right.
One of the tools that we have used in this virtual setting is a rules of engagement way of building norms up front to invest some time
Absolutely.
in creating a commonality of approach, interests, and process, recognizing that we will get maybe 85% of everybody in agreement, and there will be outliers,
Yeah.
but as a way of forming a team within that time context.
Yeah, yeah, no, you're exactly right. And I tend to do that through team charters. So I have each team create their own team charter, which has those rules of engagement, how they're going to handle conflict, all those sort of things. And they do that right after they compare their communication profiles and hand in their team interaction and individual interaction profiles. So any
I just wanted to agree with what Wendy said. I mean, in chat, she said that this is such a complex topic, and it really is. But and I have to go back. I mean, I wish I could give you a better comment. I'm going to have to go back and reread all of the slides. But I always thought it was so curious that when we were teaching online, there was a way in which I felt more intimate with my students. A certain type of intimacy I felt with them, I mean, with my Japanese students teaching online than in the US. Of course, in the US, our relationship is, I mean, I understand them better. It's deeper and stuff.
Yeah.
But it was just, and I'm sure that something in what you just said will probably answer that.
So you felt that you were able to develop that intimacy?
Well, at first, I mean, it was like every single semester, and I was teaching with online and up until like last semester. There was a type of intimacy I felt with my students almost at the outset, but I worked very hard to create that, and I had all sorts of little things, but it is so complex, but they would, by the end of the semester, every time, probably a third of the students were failing, maybe a fourth quarter, because they just wouldn't come to class,
Sure. Yeah.
Some of that.
Yeah. Fatigue.
Was not set into place. I mean, it's not anything I could control.
No, exactly. Yeah.
But so there was a type of intimacy that we had, but then it would sort of, it continued with some students, and some classes, and some didn't.
Yeah.
I just wanted to quickly add to that. I think setting for me during COVID. Hey, everybody, this is my dog, Max. I'm in my home and we're hearing the doorbell, and, let me just grab a cup of coffee. That created something, because we were all home and in the same situation. The other comment I wanted to make, Nancy, I'm not sure where this fits, but the sense of fun in a meeting. And when you're in person, whether you're a faculty at a meeting or, your students in a classroom, the sidebar, the friend that's making a joke, looking forward to seeing people, sometimes that fun aspect isn't there when you're not sitting next to your friends.
Absolutely.
And over time, you figure out how to do it. There's always that joker that you work with, and then they send you the joke via text while you're trying to pay attention, and that's the camaraderie and the fun aspect that isn't always there.
No, you're exactly right. You're exactly right. And that warmth, that that affective nature of relationships, that's really hard to develop. Yeah. Yeah. You know, interesting, Jeff, because, and I know, if anybody, I should say, or Jeff, do you want to say your spiel about if anybody wants to leave?
Yeah, maybe I'll just, yeah, so real quick. Thank you everyone for joining today. If you need to drop off, please do. I know some folks have already had to go. Just a couple of really quick notes. I'm gonna resend an updated schedule, as well as the video of this, early next week. The next session is May 10th, leading through nonverbal communication across cultures. That's Xiao-Ping Chen. We also have a CTAR, France is doing an interview of Nancy, Wendy, and Xiao-Ping. I'll have a link to that. I'll send out. Also, May 7th and 21st, we're doing the ICH trainer certification. So if you have a colleague that you think would appreciate becoming certified, it's complimentary. And in addition to other things, you get to attend these wonderful talks. So I'll send out a link to that afterwards. I'm here, Nancy. I think, can you hang out for a few more minutes
Absolutely.
in case people want to continue the conversation?
Yeah. I just wanted to comment on Jeff's question about, you know, the Chinese doing better with virtual communication than the Americans. And I think it kind of points to something you're mentioning, Michelle, is I think it's how do people form relationships and what do they expect in that relationship development? You know, I think many people, many students might expect kind of those warm and, you know, from the US, or at least from the South, expect kind of those warm and fuzzies. They want you to develop, you know, real, you know, tighter bonds, whereas, you know, affective bonds, where I don't know, maybe in the Chinese setting, the affective bonds are developed in a different way, you know, that allowed the virtual communication to be more effective there.
And the power difference. Sometimes students, you know, that are exchange students or international students may sit back and listen to a lecture and not
Yes,
jump in,
absolutely.
not feel as comfortable. And then the setting changes virtually where
Yep.
there's less of that, you know, power structure of the classroom.
Absolutely. And that's exactly, again, just going back to what my students yesterday said when they were talking about email communication. It was very interesting. I said, how did you feel about this email negotiation? And some people hated it and some people loved it. And, you know, people who loved it were for the reason, you know, you mentioned, Michelle. Anyone else? Well, it sure is great to have you. Thank you for being here on a Friday afternoon. And I hope you have a lovely weekend.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah,
Bye, everybody.
I'm not quite finished.
Okay. All right.
Sorry. I was like, oh, well.